In 1871, a man named Karl Mach wandered into the high grasslands of what is now southeastern Zimbabwe. He wasn't looking for a lost city. He was looking for gold. But what he found instead was stone. Massive granite walls, stacked without mortar, shaped without modern tools, curving in ways that seemed both deliberate and impossible, rising from the landscape like a question that had waited centuries to be asked. There was no writing, no sign of conquest, no plaques or dates or markers, just stone. In the middle of nowhere, far from any known kingdom or empire, surrounded by silence. Mach, trained in the beliefs of 19th century Europe, refused to believe it could have been built by the people living nearby. That kind of architecture, he said, must have come from outsiders, maybe the Phoenicians, or the lost tribes of Israel. Anyone but Africans. He was wrong, but he wasn't alone. For decades, archaeologists, missionaries, and colonial officers all stared at these same walls and saw only what they wanted to see, not what was actually there. Because to accept the truth would mean admitting that a powerful, organized, and technologically advanced African civilization existed long before European contact, and that was inconvenient. So the story of Great Zimbabwe wasn't just lost, it was buried. Not by time, not by weather, but by denial. And yet, the stones still stand, still curved, still silent, still waiting. Waiting for someone, not to conquer them, but to listen, to ask again, who built this? And this time, to hear the answer. What was Great Zimbabwe? Long before the name Zimbabwe marked a country on the map, it belonged to a place built from stone, not carved by empires from across the sea, not raised by pharaohs or Roman legions, but by Africans, by the ancestors of the Shona people who didn't need mortar to make walls stand. They used geometry, balance, and time. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a single building, it was a city, a complex, spread across nearly 800 hectares, with homes, towers, enclosures, terraces, and pathways, each one shaped from millions of granite blocks stacked with no adhesive, no reinforcement, just gravity and skill. It rose between the 11th and 15th centuries, and at its peak, it held over 20,000 people. This wasn't a village hidden in the bush. It was a hub, a center of trade that linked the African interior with the Indian Ocean. Gold, ivory, cattle, beads, all moved through its gates. So did ideas, so did stories. Arab traders brought glass and porcelain. Coins from Persia were found buried in the soil. Chinese ceramics rested beside handmade pots. And in the Great Enclosure, the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa, archaeologists discovered items no one expected: a soapstone bird carved with impossible grace, and gold. So much gold. Great Zimbabwe wasn't lost because it disappeared. It was lost because history chose to forget it. Not by accident, but by design. Because in a world built on the idea of African inferiority, a city like this didn't fit. So it was dismissed, minimized, erased, called a mystery. But to the people who trace their lineage back to its builders, it was never a mystery. It was a homeland, a legacy, a name that meant something. Zimbabwe, the houses of stone. And now, at last, we begin to say it again. The walls that spoke without words. There are no carvings on the granite walls of Great Zimbabwe, no kings etched into the stone, no gods watching from above. But still, they speak. They speak through shape, through scale, through silence. The walls twist and circle, forming enclosures that rise 10 meters high, without a single drop of mortar, just granite, balanced so perfectly that the stones still hold 6 centuries later. In the great enclosure, the walls don't follow straight lines. They curve, sweeping like waves across the land, as if the builders understood something deeper than utility, as if the stones were meant to flow. And inside those walls, there is a tower, a conical structure, solid and tall, with no doors, no windows, no clear function. Some call it a granary. Others say it was a shrine. No one knows for sure. But what's clear is this: it meant something. It wasn't built by accident. It was built to last, to hold a presence, to mark a center. And maybe that's what makes Great Zimbabwe so powerful. It doesn't give you all the answers. It doesn't hand you a script. It forces you to listen, to stand in the stillness, and feel. You feel the labor, the precision, the time. You feel the hands that laid stone after stone, year after year, to raise something they believed in. And though their names are gone, though no books survived, what they built didn't need words. Because a wall like this isn't just a wall. It's memory, it's presence, it's proof.
A trade empire in the heart of Africa. Centuries before colonial maps divided the continent, long before European explorers drew lines through rivers and deserts, Africa traded. And Great Zimbabwe was one of its beating hearts. From this inland stronghold, caravans moved silently across the savannas. Ox-drawn carts loaded with gold, soft and bright, mined from rivers to the south. Ivory, curved like memory, carried from elephant herds that roamed the highlands. Beads, salt, cotton, copper, all passed through these stone walls. They moved east toward the coast, to ports like Sofala and Kilwa, where Swahili traders waited with boats ready to cross the Indian Ocean. From there, the cargo changed hands, and so did stories. Persian coins, Chinese porcelain, glassware from India, silks dyed in distant lands. They all ended up here, buried beneath African soil. This wasn't isolation. This was connection. Great Zimbabwe wasn't a forgotten village in the hills. It was global before the globe had borders. It linked deep Africa to Arabia, to Asia, to the world. And it did so not through conquest, but through commerce. But trade did more than bring wealth. It shaped culture, architecture, language, belief. You can see it in the pottery, some local, some foreign. In the designs, some purely Shona, others with Arab echoes. In the stones themselves, African in origin, but arranged with a precision that rivals the temples of Greece. And yet, for all its reach, Great Zimbabwe left no palaces, no thrones of gold, no murals boasting power. Its pride was in what it built and what it moved, not in who sat on top. That may be why it disappeared quietly. Not in fire, not in war, but in a slow fading of influence as the world moved on and history looked elsewhere. The collapse. Why it was abandoned. Great Zimbabwe wasn't destroyed by war. It wasn't burned. It wasn't conquered. It faded. And perhaps that's what makes its silence so haunting. The walls still stood. The towers didn't fall, but the people left. By the late 1400s, the city was nearly empty. Grass grew through courtyards that once echoed with trade. The stone paths that led to gold mines went unused. And slowly, nature reclaimed what man had built. Why? Some point to the soil. Too many people, too many cattle. The land had been overworked, the trees cut down, the rivers strained. A classic story, growth without limit, until the land could give no more. Others looked to trade routes. As coastal ports like Kilwa rose in power, the inland path became less crucial. New kingdoms, rising further north, drew the attention, the goods, the gold. Great Zimbabwe was no longer the hub. It was a detour. Then there's climate. Evidence suggests a centuries-long drought may have hit southern Africa. Crops failed, water dried up, communities scattered in search of rain and survival. But perhaps the most human answer is simply change. People moved, not out of desperation, but out of choice. Leaders shifted power. New cities were founded. New walls were built elsewhere. Great Zimbabwe didn't die in flames. It was outgrown and then forgotten. But what it left behind wasn't just stone. It left a question. How could something so massive, so important, disappear so quietly? And the answer may say more about how we remember history than how it actually happened. Colonial lies. Denying African greatness. When Europeans first saw Great Zimbabwe, they didn't say, "This is incredible." They said, "This can't be African." It was the late 1800s. British colonists, explorers, surveyors, treasure hunters came across the ruins, and what they found didn't fit the story they had brought with them. Massive stone walls, skilled architecture, trade routes reaching China and Persia. That didn't align with the myth they believed, the myth they needed, that Africa had no history worth remembering until Europe arrived. So they made something up. They claimed the ruins were built by foreigners, Phoenicians, Arabs, even the lost tribes of Israel, anyone but Africans. In 1905, British archaeologist David Randall McIver challenged that narrative. He studied the artifacts, the pottery, the tools, and he said, plainly, this was built by native Africans. But his work was buried, dismissed, suppressed. Because empires aren't just built on land, they're built on ideas. And one of the most powerful ideas in colonial history was that African people were incapable of greatness. Great Zimbabwe shattered that illusion. So instead of celebrating it, they erased it. For decades, schoolbooks in Rhodesia taught that Black Africans couldn't have built the site. Museums showed maps with question marks over the ruins. Even when evidence piled up, carbon dating, linguistic studies, oral histories, the story didn't change. Because it wasn't about truth, it was about control. To admit that Great Zimbabwe was African meant admitting that Africans once ruled, built, traded, innovated without Europe. And that was dangerous to those writing the history. So they built a wall of their own, not of stone, but of silence. The city of gold. What they left behind. They didn't leave behind treasure in the way we think of it. No jeweled thrones, no golden statues of kings, no vaults of coins hidden behind secret doors. But what archaeologists found in Great Zimbabwe was something else. Fragments of Chinese porcelain, glass beads from Persia, Arabian coins, Indian cloth, all hidden under centuries of dust, all proof that this city, built deep in the African interior, was once connected to the world. It wasn't just a fortress, it was a hub, a center of commerce that stretched from the Swahili coast to the Indian Ocean and beyond. The trade flowed outward, ivory, gold, copper, salt, cattle, and flowed inward, ideas, technology, language, religion. Great Zimbabwe wasn't isolated. It was plugged in, long before there were maps to show it. And at the heart of it all was gold. The nearby mines, shallow, simple, produced enough to draw traders from 1,000 miles away. Gold that shimmered not in palaces, but in ornaments, rings, and ceremonial tools now scattered across museums in Europe, not by accident, but by removal. Because most of what Great Zimbabwe left behind isn't here anymore. It was taken, piece by piece, box by box, shipped overseas and displayed without names, without context, just a small plaque, origin, unknown.
But even without treasure, the city speaks, through the way its walls stand, through what the archaeologists found beneath its floors, through the trade routes traced like ghost lines across the map of Africa. This wasn't a lost city, it was a taken one. And silence. No army came to tear the city down. No empire marched across the plains to burn it. No great fire. No plague. And yet, by the late 1400s, Great Zimbabwe was empty. The walls still stood, but the voices inside them were gone. Thoughtful. What happened? Historians and archaeologists have spent decades trying to answer that. And the truth is, there wasn't one single reason. There were many, and they came slowly. The gold, once the city's lifeblood, began to run dry. The shallow mines couldn't keep up with demand. Trade routes shifted. New ports rose on the coast, closer to the ocean, easier to access. And Great Zimbabwe, once the beating heart of a network, was bypassed. But trade alone didn't kill the city. The soil, overworked and exhausted, began to fail. Cattle overgrazed the land. Fields turned dry. And with it, the food supply collapsed. Add to that internal tensions, rival leaders, succession disputes, perhaps even rebellion, and a fragile system began to crack. Eventually, the people left. Some moved north, others splintered into smaller chiefdoms. They took their stories with them, oral histories passed down across generations. But the city they built was left to the wind and the grass. Nature crept back in. Dust covered the stone floors. Lichen spread across the walls. Birds nested in towers once meant to touch the sky. And for centuries, Great Zimbabwe sat in silence. Not destroyed, just forgotten. Not by the descendants who remembered it in story, but by the world beyond, which never knew it had existed. The theft of history. When European explorers reached the ruins of Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they saw something they didn't expect. Massive stone walls, perfectly fitted. Structures that had stood for centuries, untouched by cement. Bold, sophisticated, monumental. And they asked the same question the locals had been asked for generations. Who built this? But their answer wasn't curiosity. It was denial. Because these walls didn't fit the narrative they brought with them, that Africa was primitive, that black civilizations could not build in stone, could not trade with the world, could not rise and fall by their own hands. So they rewrote the answer. Some said it was the Phoenicians. Others claimed ancient Hebrews, Egyptians, even survivors of Atlantis. Anything, anyone, except the people who still lived nearby. Except the Shona. In 1905, British archaeologist David Randall MacIver studied the site carefully. He concluded what was clear to anyone who looked closely, that the architecture, tools, pottery, all of it, pointed to local African origin. But his findings were dismissed, buried, ignored, because it wasn't about truth, it was about empire. Colonial powers didn't want Africa to have a past, because a people with history are harder to conquer, harder to erase. So the ruins were framed as a mystery. The textbooks labeled them anomaly, and the builders were left unnamed, not because no one knew, but because some chose not to know. It wasn't until Zimbabwe gained independence in 1980 that the truth was reclaimed. The country took its name from the ruins. Zimbabwe, from Zimba Zamabwe, houses of stone. A declaration, a homecoming, a refusal to be erased. Because Great Zimbabwe was never a myth. It was memory, stolen, silenced, and now returned. What remains? Great Zimbabwe is quiet now. The markets are gone. The songs have faded. The towers no longer echo with the sounds of life, just wind, and the soft rustle of grass between the stones. But still, it stands, The walls haven't fallen. The granite hasn't cracked. After centuries of silence, invasion, denial, it's still here. And sometimes, that's enough. Because ruins are not just what's left behind. They're what endures. They carry stories that no one wanted told. Proof that greatness didn't begin in the West. That a civilization can rise, flourish, and shape the world without ever being written into someone else's textbook. Today, the people of Zimbabwe walk among these stones, not as tourists or outsiders, but as descendants, children of builders, heirs to a memory that refused to die. And maybe that's the real legacy of Great Zimbabwe. Not the gold, not the trade, not the towers, but the fact that it still dares to exist. That despite everything, colonial erasure, academic doubt, time itself, it never gave in to being forgotten. So the next time someone asks you where the great cities of history were built, don't just say Rome. Don't just say Athens. Say Great Zimbabwe. Because the story of human civilization was never just one chapter. It was always a mosaic. And this is one of its brightest stones.
If you've made it this far, thank you. Not just for watching, but for staying with a story that many never hear. And fewer still, remember. Great Zimbabwe was never just a ruin. It was a city, a home, a heartbeat. And every stone still standing is a reminder that history is bigger than what we're told, and older than the books that try to hold it. So, if this story stayed with you, share it. Not for the algorithm, not for me, but because the people who built these walls deserve more than silence. They deserve to be seen. And if you believe some truth should never stay buried, subscribe. Not to follow a channel, but to keep a space open for stories that history almost forgot. Because sometimes, what we choose to remember says just as much as what the world tried to erase.